Crumb are a four-piece indie band from Brooklyn, USA. They make incredibly dreamy, introspective, jazzy, psychedelic music that exploded in popularity online following their debut release in 2016. Their arrangement and songwriting abilities have had me shook for years. One aspect of their music which deserves more recognition, in my opinion, is their chord progressions. Today, I'll be breaking down a few of my favorites. Plans from their Locket EP and Part 3 and Ghostride from their album Jinx. The song Ghostride is in D major. It starts off on the 1 chord, D major 7, then moves up to F sharp major, already leaving the D major scale with that B flat, but then it goes back into scale with the F sharp minor, and the chord progression finishes back on D major 7. So it has this kind of effect where it starts out really nice and then it gets a little bit spicy out of scale, but then slowly returns to normalcy and eventually returns back to the starting chord before the loop. And the effect this has on me is it sounds like the progression is kind of gaining confidence but then slowly receding back to its original place. Now the melody features a C natural, which would normally clash with the C sharp of the D major 7. However, the way that they're played is it's not just a straight chord. The guitar is playing the chord progression with a downwards arpeggio of 16th triplets that sounds like this. So as a result, the time when the C sharp is being hit is at a totally different time to when the melody is hitting the C sharp. And so they don't clash at all. And you have a nice kind of ambiguity between it being a D major 7 and a D major dominant 7. And this emphasizes the jazziness of the two instruments playing together. If I was to play the guitar an octave higher just so that my fingers have space to move, you can hear how the melody and the chords play into each other. Then it moves up to the F sharp major, and it's got that E natural in the melody, which makes it more of like an F sharp major dominant chord. Immediately slipping that B flat back down to an A, then returning to D major 7. Another interesting thing to note is that the melody often ends up on this A flat here. And in the scale of D major, that A flat is a flat 5, which means it's out of the scale and it's creating that really jazzy, dissonant feeling. The obvious resolution to that melody would be something more like a... However, it's left to hang on that flat 5, which feels very spicy. This dissonance creates a really nice transition into the chorus because it moves up to the 4 chord playing a G major 7. So going from the 1 chord, D major, to the 4 chord, which is a G major, we're moving one step around the circle of fifths. So it's going to have a really nice easy modulation. And we're not only doing that, we're going from a super spicy dissonant chord to a G major 7. And it just sounds so satisfying. I can't describe it. When it hits, it feels like it's washing over you, and the arrangement complements this perfectly. So the chord progression for the chorus is relatively simple. It just goes from that G major 7, the 4 chord, down to the 3 chord, which is the F sharp minor. This is one of my favorite chord progressions. Going between the 4 and the 3 creates this really nice sense of back and forth. It never quite resolves, but it still feels very satisfying, and it leaves a lot of room for resolution when we do eventually return back to the 1. So this progression is looped 3 times, and then the 4th time it falls down from the 3 to the 2, and we're playing an E minor. And then it switches from the E minor to an E minor 6. And that just adds to the dissonance before it then finally does resolve back to the first chord of the verse, which is, as we know, the D major 7. So altogether, that sounds something like this. 3 is really interesting because I think there's two ways you could look at the chord progression. You could think of it as solely being in G major with just with certain jazzy chords, but the way that I naturally thought of it, with my lack of classical training, is by thinking of the progression as modulating between E major and G major every time the progression loops. So the chords are E major, then it goes down to C sharp major dominant 7, then it goes down one semitone to C major 7, and then around the circle of fifths one step to G major 7. So I categorize that as the first two chords kind of being in E major, and then the second two chords as being in G major. And this is kind of backed up by the melodic movement. The notes that are in the melody do belong to each of these respective scales as that part of the progression is playing. And so that's just how I'm going to explain it for this video. Luckily, the 4 chords are evenly spaced. They play for 1 bar each, which makes it a little bit easier to understand. So the first chord, E major, then it moves down to a C sharp dominant 7. And if you know the E major scale, C sharp should be a minor chord. They've made it a major chord just in traditional jazzy Crumb fashion. Despite this, I still think of it as being an E major. That's just a little chord substitution they've used. And the melody lands on that B natural to really assert the dominance of the C sharp dominant 7. The next chord is the C major 7, and that is definitely not in E major, but it is a chromatic step from C sharp to C. And because we're going from a C sharp dominant 7 to a C major 7, we're basically taking that C sharp triad and shifting all 3 notes of that down one semitone. So we go from to this. But the B note kind of acts as like a pivotal root note, which really glues together the 2 chords, and I think that's just a genius little move there. C major 7 to G major 7 is a very easy, very satisfying, tried and tested sequence of chords. It's just moving down the circle of fifths by 1 step. And then from G major back to E major, we're going down a minor third. So from the context of G major, E is the 6th chord and the 6 is usually minor. But much like in the E to C sharp modulation, instead of going from the major 1 to the minor 6, they've gone from the major 1 to the major 6. So this occurs twice within the progression, and it creates this kind of unity between the 2 halves of the progression. So it's kind of set up these rules within the progression where it's very consistent, and I think that's why it makes so much sense to our ears. Another way which this song aids the transitions between the chord modulations is by a little keyboard lick where it's just 2 notes, but it goes from F sharp to G sharp. And it does this between the G chord and the E major chord, so where the progression is looping. So the chord being played is G major 7, and the 7 of that is F sharp. Right as the next bar starts, it moves up 1 step to G sharp, which if you didn't change chords there or change scales, it would sound really bad. So it feels like a really clutch moment in that sense, where if they forgot to change chord, it would sound terribly dissonant. And I think because it's out of the G major scale, it's really emphasizing that we're landing on an E major there. It's like, you can't mistake that for a minor. This is definitely a major. Now, after they loop this for the duration of the verse, there's a little bit of a change up. So after the C, instead of going to a G, we go to an A flat dominant 7 chord. You could kind of think of this as being as part of the E major scale, which is the first part of the progression. And so it kind of switches back to that before the listener expects it. And if I'm not mistaken, an entire bar is removed. So that kind of creates a shortened loop effect. So we get 4 bars of this chord. The dominant 7 note, which is a G flat, kind of alternates between being emphasized and not so much. And all the while, we have the guitar playing this little lick where it's a C sharp going down to a C. In the context of that chord, that's like the 4 going down to the 3. So it's being alternated between like a sustained chord and a dominant 7. Now later on in the song, there's another really interesting switch up where it feels like it just completely changes keys. The chord progression is again cut short on the third chord, but instead of immediately modulating down to another chord, it hangs and the vocals are just echoed out. And it feels like it could be the end of the song, but before you know it, we're thrown into this new section. The guitar is playing an arpeggio of E minor 7 and A flat major dominant 7. These arpeggios are a little bit inverted, so it can be difficult to tell what chord we're hearing initially. When the bass comes in, it's playing an interesting bass line where it starts on the root note of the chord but then goes up to the 5. So it feels like for the E minor one, the first eighth note is not inverted, but then it goes to the second inversion for the rest of the bar. And then it does the same thing for the A flat dominant 7 chord. This part honestly took me quite a while to figure out because I usually do listen out for the bass, and generally the bass gives a little bit more indication as to what the chord is, but in this case they intentionally subvert those standards, so it's a little bit more ambiguous what the chord is at any given moment. But as more and more instruments come in and as the melody comes in, your brain has a little bit more to make sense of what's going on. The melody is really beautiful in this part. It has a bit of a lullaby feel to it. Now, what the chords in this part really scream out to me is what I personally, in my brain, have categorized as the Pink Floyd progression. So if we're thinking of this in the context of E flat being the 6th chord, that means we'd be in F sharp major. E flat minor would be the 6th chord. A flat major. So this would be like the major 2 chord. So to me, that's just like the Pink Floyd chord progression. One example would be in Time by Pink Floyd. It's one of my favorite examples of it. Altogether, that sounds a little bit like this. Plants, I would say, is probably the most complicated out of the three we're going through today. It utilizes a lot of diminished chords, which I really like, and I think it has the most variation. The intro includes 4 diminished chords. So we start with C, E flat, F sharp, and it basically just walks down the inversions of this chord. So it does that 4 times. So we introduce the A down the bottom, and the C and the E flat stay the same. Then it does the same thing with an F sharp underneath, and the same thing with an E flat underneath. And then that resolves very nicely into the first chord of the verse, which is G major. So into the chord progression, so it starts out in G, the 1, goes down to the 6, E minor, and then we go to the major 3 chord, which is a B major, dominant 7. And the bass does a nice kind of inversion walk where it goes up the 4 notes of the dominant 7 chord. So it goes B, E flat, F sharp, A, and then that allows it to land nicely back on the G, which is the 1. And it goes back up to that major 3 chord one more time, the B dominant 7. And that's repeated one more time, and the transition from the verse to the chorus, it starts on the 1 regular 3 chord, so the minor 7. And does a nice chromatic walk down, so it goes B minor 7, B flat minor 7, A minor 7. This particular chromatic walk from the flat 3 to the 2 is something I really like. You can hear it in Tado by Masigo and FKJ. You can also hear it in my song, Not That Easy. So it's a very nice jazzy progression, and Crumb have used it here just for the transitional moment. And then they follow that by 2 really interesting spicy chords, which were D major dominant 7 and B flat dominant 7. Down a tritone to E minor. Now, the chorus has a very similar progression to the verse, just that it starts on an E minor instead. The first time, and then when it comes back to loop, it starts on the G the same way that the verse did. So we get something like this. Now there's a really nice post-chorus kind of guitar solo after this, and it has a really interesting chord progression with a very different rhythm. It starts on the G major 6 again, and then it goes up to a C sharp minor 7 flat 5. The first time it just goes from the G major 7 to the C sharp minor 7 flat 5. The second time it does that same thing and goes down and resolves to the C major 7. So because we have that flat 5 in there, very nice spicy chord, but it is also only 1 semitone away from the next chord, being the C major 7. It loops that progression, but it changes the rhythm of the chords being played, and so that sounds a little bit like this. And then we're back into the verse. So altogether, the song sounds like this. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this style of video. Thought I'd try something different today. Let me know in the comments if you have any thoughts on what I've done, if there's any other songs or artists you'd like me to break down. I'm really into learning this kind of stuff, and it's heaps of fun applying it to my own music. There's so much to be learned from studying other artists, you know, there's heaps of different hidden techniques that you wouldn't even think to do. You can just gather these ideas from all around the place and combine them in unique ways, and that ultimately is how new art is created. If you like this video, please leave a like, and if you want to see more of this content, do not hesitate to subscribe. I've been Josh 10, and I will be tomorrow. See you next Friday.